Hello, my name's Tiffany Taylor. I'm an evolutionary biologist at the University of Bath within the Milner Centre for Evolution, and I have written a children's book on genetics called Little Letters, and it's aimed at 6 to 9-year-olds. And this book introduces concepts of DNA, genes, and genetics through fun fictional characters called the Rinky Dinks. And the idea is that because it's told within a fun bedtime story, it should explore the ideas of genetics through a narrative that engages children. I'm here with Professor Laurence Hurst, who's the director of the Milner Centre, and we're here to discuss the book and some of the ideas that led to the project.
Hello, welcome. Very nice to see you, Tiffany.
Why do you think it's important that young people engage in genetics?
Well, why is it important that anybody engages in genetics? It's actually one of the oldest questions. You can go back to the ancient Greeks, and they were always wondering about why it is that offspring look a bit like their parents. And there's a hidden mechanism somewhere there. And the remarkable thing about genetics is we only really know that answer since the latter part of the 19th century. And even then, we didn't really understand it. We had an idea of what must be going on from Mendel. But it took until the discovery of DNA and the structure of DNA for us to really work that out. So we've only really understood genetics in a deep sense for the last 50 years or so. But understanding genetics is then really helpful on so many different fronts. You want to understand genetic diseases, well, you need to understand the basis of a genetic disease, for example. You want to do crop improvement. You want to make a difference in agriculture. You need to understand the underlying genetics. So it's got very big applications, but it's also just one of those questions that is one of the great blue skies questions. Why do offspring look like their parents? One of the amazing things about genetics is that we've now discovered is this stuff, DNA, seems to be universal to all life. And you've come up with an interesting world in which you've invented your own life, these Grindykings. Why did you go down the line of inventing an organism that had DNA rather than using a well-known organism, you might say?
That's a good question. So in 2012, I released my first book, Little Changes, which is where the Rinky Dinks first appeared. And this is aimed at the same audience age range, about 6 to 9-year-olds. But it explored the major concepts of evolution. And my approach for both of these books, firstly, was to make a story that was the centre focus. I wanted the story to be the important message. And storytelling has been a tool used in teaching for as long as we can tell. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that when learning is structured around a narrative, it helps to improve both understanding and retention of information. So I decided to use a fictional character to underpin the scientific concepts I was trying to impart, partly because it means I could exaggerate features that were important to communicate ideas. So in the case of the Rinky Dinks, the tales of the Rinky Dinks are very central to their story of speciation and adaptation. But also what it allowed is more imagination from the reader. And engaging the imagination is also really key for communication because it allows the reader to engage with the story and as such the story's content at a much deeper level, and that's obviously better for learning. So my motivation really for introducing these seemingly complex scientific ideas to a young audience is that evolution allows a foundation on which biology can be understood. And I think this is the order it should go in, because biology and the living world are inherently complex. And I think to start with this complexity without any understanding of where the complexity comes from seems the wrong way round. And not just to me, but also there's a very famous scientist, Dobzhansky, who once said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I'm very much inclined to agree. So the idea for Little Letters came about after reading about your paper, Professor Hurst, that showed that teaching genetics prior to teaching evolution improved understanding of evolution. So I thought that by extending this imaginary world and the Rinky Dinks across both disciplines, evolution and genetics, of which there are many obvious overlaps and links, there's the potential for connections to be made by the reader between the two stories that could then facilitate links as their knowledge of the two disciplines grew. So hopefully, as they're introduced to more in-depth learning and more in-depth material in the curriculum as they get older, the seeds of knowledge that were planted from these simple stories from when they were younger might accelerate the growth of these seeds and the understanding of topics in later years. So I think this fictional imaginary world just helps implant those ideas and those seeds in sort of younger children.
I think a lot of what you say makes perfect sense in terms of the research that we've done. So yes, as you say, we found that if you teach genetics before you teach evolution, it improves students' understanding of evolution, and it improves their understanding of genetics, interesting. It provides a concrete framework around which to build evolutionary ideas. Otherwise, they can be rather abstract, I think. But I think some of our more recent data actually is from in-school trials in primary schools, very much also supports your idea of the role of narrative as a means to engage. So we've been having a look in primary schools to see what's the best method to teach about genetics and evolution. And we've actually found that giving them a story, a narrative story, a picture book story, is actually more effective than getting them to actually do sort of hands-on experiments, which is a most unusual result, I think. But it's very clear. The other interesting result is, again, rather against the conventional wisdom, we found that teaching them about things that aren't human actually engages them. It engages them in terms of their imagination. So we gave a choice between studying trilobites, long extinct things that they couldn't possibly have as pets, versus studying their own bodies, for example. And they actually do best when they're given a storybook format, learning about something that isn't themselves. So I suspect it'll be interesting to see what the data comes back from as regards your book, but I suspect the Grindykink story will actually be a very effective mechanism to really engage the students, and engagement is the first component of all good effective learning, I think. So I'd be very surprised if it doesn't work.
I hope so. So Laurence, could you tell me a little bit more about the Milner Centre for Evolution and its role in communicating research to the wider community?
Yeah, so the Milner Centre is, we think it's probably unique in the world. So it's an accumulation of 25 or so researchers, and from the outside we look as though we're normal academic researchers. We ask brilliant blue skies questions about organisms that are evolutionary questions. Why, for example, do two organisms ever cooperate with each other? The sort of questions that you asked, Tiffany, I think, again, are fantastic blue skies questions. Why is evolution sometimes incredibly repeatable, and other times you give the same organism the same evolutionary test and it comes up with a different answer every time? Questions like those are just really great questions. So we study these great blue skies questions. Why? Because they are just profoundly interesting questions. But the flip side of asking just really good blue skies questions is that people really want to know the answer to them. If you actually pose a question really well evolutionarily, it's like reading a great Agatha Christie. You want to know who did it. You want to know what the answer is. And so we also see that we have a responsibility not just to do good research, but to explain that research. But explaining the research doesn't just simply mean going out and trying to explain it. There are good ways and there are bad ways. And a lot of our researchers also know how best it is to actually do outreach, do teaching, do engagement, and so on and so forth. And in many regards, this is just another empirical question. How best do we actually teach? How best do we get across difficult concepts? And in the case of evolution, concepts that many people find hard to take. What we're finding, though, is the bigger problem is that the ideas of evolution and the ideas within genetics are actually very abstract concepts. They're quite hard to get a handle on. But finding good techniques that you can actually show by randomized controlled trials, for example, that they do actually work and that they make a difference, a positive difference, is, I think, a very important platform for the Milner Centre itself.
Well, thank you very much for listening. So the book Little Letters, that was funded from a public engagement grant from the Genetics Society, is available to read for free at www.littlelettersgenetics.co.uk. And for any further information, you can go to the website and find out more.